Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round 3 coverage of the 2015 Women's World Chess Championship taking place now in Sochi, Russia. For round 3, I selected the game between Antoaneta Stefanova of Bulgaria with the white pieces and Maria Muzychuk of Ukraine with the black pieces. This was one of the games played at the slow time control, not one of the rapid playoff games. So Antoaneta starts off with knight to f3, very flexible move and leading to all different kinds of openings. We could get a reti opening, for example, if black were to play d5 and white were to respond with c4. It's one way it can go. But in this case, Maria Muzychuk plays the move knight to f6, so we get a very flexible response, also the most common response in this position, kind of a waiting move. The knight often wants to go to this square anyway, and waiting to see what kind of setup that the white player has in mind. So Antoaneta responds with c4, so we get kind of an English opening. And now g6, very typical kind of response. g3, bishop g7, and bishop g2. And right here is the move which gives the opening its distinct flavor. If we just castled here, we could stay in English opening territory, or we could play this move c5 and go to a symmetrical English. But the move that Maria played was d5. And now what we've transposed into is a kind of Grunfeld, particularly after the white player plays the top choice here, which is d4. There are other moves here. C takes d5 could be played immediately, followed by d4, which would be an interesting way to play. But d4 was played. It's one of the top choices, and actually a top choice in the database and one of the top choices in the engine. Just gaining that space in the center. But this is different from ordinary Grunfeld. If black were to castle here, then we would have transposed into a Grunfeld completely. So after castling, knight pawn takes on d5 could have been played, and after knight takes, then knight to c3 would get a typical Grunfeld kind of setup. But in this position, it's black's turn to move, and black prevents that by taking on c4 herself. So black plays d takes c4 instead of waiting for white to play c takes d5. And now the white player, Antoaneta, has a choice of how to round up the pawn. She can play queen a4 check and pick it up that way, or knight a3 and pick it up with the knight. And knight a3 is the more popular choice. It, I suppose, makes more sense to get a knight on this square than a queen, which might get chased around. Notice that b5 can't really be played here. Yeah, I guess it not. I was wondering just for a second if there was some check, but the queen is not coming out with check because the pawn is still on c7. So there's no danger of this pawn being protected. White is going to round that pawn up comfortably. So Maria could just play a developing move, but she chooses to play the move c3, which is actually the top choice in the database. So we're following some kind of known line so far. This pawn was going to be lost anyway, so the black player chooses to push the pawn forward in order to create a different pawn structure. So now there's these two pawns, which may be a strength or a weakness. We'll just have to wait and see how the game develops. Now Maria castles, Antoaneta castles, and plays the move c5. And we get a very typical kind of strategy that you see in the Grunfeld defense. So this opening technically was classified as a Neo-Grunfeld, but has a lot of the same ideas as the Grunfeld, which is that the player with the black pieces is allowing the white player to build up a strong center, and then her plan is to counterattack that center with pieces and with moves like c5, putting pressure on the d4 point, and knight to c6, and the bishop here, all coordinating on the d4 square. Very typical Grunfeld strategy. And to defend against that, the top choice in the database here is e3. I'll get a very typical kind of structure. But right here, there's another option, and actually it's the one of the top choices of the chess engine, and that's what Antoaneta chooses here, Rook e1. So an unusual move in the opening book, but it looks like a very well-founded move The idea is, instead of putting this pawn on e3 where it blocks the bishop, just go for the big center right away with pawn to e4 supported by the rook. So knight c6, black continues with this strategy of counterattacking the center, pressure on d4, and e4 is played. Now this pawn on d4 can be exchanged off, bringing the c pawn forward, and bishop g4. So we get this very typical structure the white has with 5 pawns against 4 pawns. And this can arise in other openings besides the Grunfeld. It can come out of a semi-Tarrasch, for example. And it's a very interesting kind of dynamic opening with possibilities for both sides. It looks at first like white has all the better of it because white has the center, more space, the development is even, and so it looks like white just should be better. But there are some problems potentially, and one of them is that this pawn on d4 is a bit fragile. It's out here and there's no other pawn to support it. It can go to a stable position by advancing to d5, but if it does that, it gives up control of the squares c5 and e5. So it's going to have to give up on controlling those squares if it wants to move forward and have security. So that's the kind of trade-off. The white player generally prefers to keep the pawns back like this, controlling all the squares in the center and trying to get good, better squares for her pieces than her opponent. And the black player, of course, is trying to counterattack these pawns and put pressure on them. And you see that already we have a number of pieces that are lined up and aimed at the d4 pawn. And but white is carefully arranging a defense of the d4 pawn, starting with the move bishop to b2. And so this continues for a while. There's some maneuvering with the knights. The knight goes to d7, opening up the diagonal of the bishop. White's knight comes to c2, another defender of the d4 square. Now the knight goes over to b4. So the knight is just staying out of the way in a sense. It's out of the way of the queen, it's out of the way of the bishop. So now all 3 of these pieces are looking at the d4 pawn, but there are 4 defenders, so everything is fine from white's point of view. Rook to b1 was played, maybe with ideas of activating the rook along the b file, even putting pressure on the b pawn, depending on how black develops from this point. And now the first slight inaccuracy in the game. I would say so far is a very even game and very typical of this kind of opening. The strategy that both sides are following is pretty logical and straightforward. The first slightly inaccurate move is the move queen to c7. Now this is a very logical move that Maria played here because it has the idea of bringing a rook over, and the rook is a better attacker than the queen. Another piece to attack the d-pawn with, and perhaps the queen has other things it can do along this diagonal. But just for a moment it released some pressure from this d-pawn. So now there's only 2 pieces attacking it, and Antoinette takes advantage of this by playing the move knight to e3. So this knight that was previously defending the pawn has rerouted and is got a central location and attacking the bishop. And it's really putting the question to that bishop where it wants to go. And there just aren't a whole lot of good squares. If the bishop retreats, then white just has a tremendous advantage in space, and black does not have any real compensation. So bishop takes f3 is practically forced. It's really the only way for black to stay in the game at this point. But black had to give up the bishop pair. So now white has the advantage in space and the advantage of the bishop pair. But there's still some lingering issues with these pawns. And so Antoinette works to resolve that. First, it's black's turn to move here. Maria plays rook to d8. That was the whole idea of getting the queen out of the way, was getting the rook on the d file. And now Antoinette replies with knight to d5. Another move was possible here. It was also possible to play pawn to d5 at this point. But as I mentioned, here, let's erase that arrow so you can just see this one. Bringing the pawn to d5 is a move that the white player is a little bit reluctant to play because it does give up control of some of these squares. So knight d5 is a move that makes perfect sense, and it's also a move that keeps an advantage to white. But there are now two ways for Maria to respond here. Notice the knight is attacking the queen, and it's attacking the knight on b6. So the two options are either to take the knight or to move the queen. And Maria chose to move the queen, which is an interesting choice because it allows some damage to the pawn structure over here. So let's take a minute and explore the alternative, which the chess engine indicates this really is playable. She could have played, knight takes d5. And after pawn takes, this knight doesn't have many squares, but it turns out it can go to b5. So knight to b5, putting some pressure on this d-pawn. But, well, a move like queen b3 defends the b-pawn, attacks the knight. Now queen d6, lining up to blockade that d-pawn and put some more pressure on it, and bishop to a3, pinning the knight. And now we can, well, before we stop here, you need to defend the knight with a5. So this is the kind of position that might have arisen. The chess engine rates this as a slight advantage for white, but not a huge advantage. So it's an interesting way to play. In the long run, these are weaknesses, these doubled pawns here. The material, by the way, is still even. There's 6 pawns for white and 4 and 2, 6 pawns for black. These doubled pawns are definitely a weakness, but also black's position is a bit strained. Everything is sort of barely hanging together. This knight is pinned and can hardly move. So it's not clear how black would make any progress from this position. So a difficult position to play, and it's understandable that Maria avoided that. But in not taking and just moving the queen, which is what was played, the queen went to d7, she's allowed Antoinetta to damage her pawn structure. So knight takes, b6 was played, a takes b6. Of course, this damage has a flip side, which is that this rook is now activated, so pros and cons. But the damaged pawn structure belongs to black instead of white, and black is still looking for more activity for her pieces. White still has the advantage of space and the bishop pair now because the bishop was traded off on f3, so white has the bishop pair advantage. So in this position, d5 was played finally. Usually this has to be played sooner or later. These pawns can't stay side by side forever. They just get under too much pressure, and so finally it's pushed forward, and actually the chess engine approves this is the right time to do that. Of course, white would be happy to trade off this dark squared bishop. This is one of black's strongest pieces in the position, and Maria naturally avoids that by playing knight to e5. So all of these are good moves, but white is keeping that advantage. Now notice that this pawn is loose on a2, and the knight is attacking the bishop, and bishop to e2 is played. So she's choosing to keep the bishop pair, Antoinetta is, and just giving up on the a2 pawn, which is taken. Rook takes a2 is played. And this is good, still good for white. So even a pawn down, having the advantage in space in the bishop pair, and also the extra pawn that black has is this weak doubled pawn over here on the b file, and that could really be taken at any time, so that hardly counts as an extra pawn, and this still has a pretty strong, this position has a pretty good advantage to white. Okay, so rook d to a8 was played. The chess engine actually prefers the move queen to a4, but I think that might lead to just too much simplification. But just to show the chess engine line, it's queen to a4, and then queen takes b6. So just giving up on the pawn and going for activity. And the problem now is that this is going to be a weak pawn, and could be that white is just going to emerge from this situation a pawn up after the b pawn falls. But Maria plays the move rook d to a8, so doubling the rooks on the a file. This rook, of course, was under attack and had to be defended. And now f4 is played, kicking the knight, and white's advantage has been growing steadily. The space advantage is continuing to grow, and the black pieces are getting kicked around. But the knight can go to g4, and white's still not tempted to trade this knight off, but she pushes on with e5. And that's an interesting choice. Let's take a look and see I think it's not so great to trade bishops here, but I wanted to check it out. It is actually playable. Yeah, it's just that in this position, e5 is a stronger move, so there's no tactical reason. Bishop takes g7 could have been played. But so that's one way to go for just a slight edge for white. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and queen takes b6. Another example of how that pawn can really be captured pretty much at any time. But this position is rated only about even, so not such a great situation for white. So white is playing for more. And in fact, this move, e5 that was played, is the strongest move and keeps an edge for white. Pretty significant edge. But, well, black gets the move h5 in, supporting the knight. And now bishop to b5, harassing the queen. The queen goes to f5. One thing to watch out for is that all these pawn moves have set up an oppressive-looking formation here, but they've also opened some lines towards the white's king. So white has to play carefully, but in general, if white can get away with this big space grab, looks like a big advantage. But right here is the first slight slip from the white player, from Antoinetta. So she played the move rook to d1, rook b to d1. A bit of a mistake. So the chess engine line, just to show the best moves from this point, bishop to d3, kicking the queen. The queen drops back to d7. Once again, this pawn can be taken at any time, but the engine is recommending a different way of playing with rook e2, trying to maintain control of this second rank here. So the engine is actually showing a little concern about attacks along the second rank here, and we'll see why. Say h4 to try and undermine, or perhaps knight to h6. Now let's see what's a good move here. Maybe just king to h7 to illustrate what's going on. I don't think there's any great move for black in this position. And now rook to e1. This is the idea. Bring the rooks to a position where they defend each other, freeing up this bishop to move without giving away the second rank. And this should be a nice edge for white. So that's how best play would proceed at this point. What Antoinetta played was rook d to b1. So let's put this move on the board. And now Maria, it's her turn to spot the slight mistake and take advantage of it. And she immediately pushes on with h4, top choice, and starting to chip away at white's kingside safety here. So it's an interesting move. Rook to e2 is played now. So still with the idea of maintaining control of the second rank, but it's not quite so easy at this point. So the knight drops back to h6, and the move queen to f3 is played. And this move is the second slight mistake. So it looks like instead of queen to f3, a move like bishop to c4, rook to g2. That's interesting. It's just some kind of defensive move, trying to sit on the position a little bit. Also, bishop c4 opens up the idea of taking the pawn on b6, which is interesting, keeping pressure on that pawn. Seems like both players are sort of neglecting these two pawns over here, but there's a certain point in the game when those pawns start to play a role, so somehow they got neglected for just a little bit too long. Anyway, the move that was played was queen to f3, and that allows an interesting tactic here. So here's your chance to see if you can spot a tactic. Yeah, pause the video if you want some time to think about it. What Maria played here was rook takes bishop. So this is an exchange sacrifice, just giving up the rook for the bishop. But she gets more than just the bishop for her trouble. She also gets a pawn here because this was the tactic. There's a pin on the f-pawn, and so by distracting the rook, if we back up to this position, you'll see the rook was defending the e-pawn. This f-pawn is pinned, so by distracting the rook, by taking the bishop and distracting the rook has to take back. Then she can grab the e-pawn here and disrupt white's pawn structure. So black is down the exchange, but with some interesting compensation, including a pawn, and including the fact that this bishop is on a dark square, and white does not have a dark squared bishop, so this bishop is basically unopposed on the dark squares. And you notice the king is still sitting on this dark squared diagonal, so there could be some dangerous threats along that diagonal. So, but the play continues. Rook to e2 was played here. The rook was under attack, so it's going to chase the bishop away. The bishop drops back to d6, which is an important move. It keeps this pawn securely blocked on a light square, and that's another factor in this position. This light squared bishop is somewhat hampered by the presence of this pawn in the center of the board on the same color. So bishop to d3 was played, chasing the queen. Queen drops back to f6, getting off the light squares and onto the dark squares. The king comes up to g2, so all very logical, getting on the light squares away from that rampaging bishop on the dark squares. King to g7, queen to e3. There's a bit of maneuvering here. There's no immediate breakthrough. And now the very interesting move, bishop to c5. And why this is interesting is this allows a queen trade. So this is something that is kind of surprising. Normally when you have given up the exchange, you want to play with all the pieces that you have left. You're not anxious to trade pieces off because your advantage with the exchange, having given up the exchange, your advantage lies in usually in some sort of immediate activity with your pieces. If you go into an endgame and exchange down, a lot of those endgames are just lost. So this move bishop to c5 is kind of surprising from that point of view. But, well, Maria has seen far enough to conclude that the endgame is okay for her. So queen to e5 is played, and now because of this pin, there's no way to avoid a trade of queens. First, Maria takes on g3, so getting rid of one of the pawn defenders around the king, and then she plays the move knight to g4, not only allowing the exchange, but virtually forcing it. So queen takes f6 was played, and now the knight takes back. So it's white's turn to move. Bishop to c4 was played. This pawn is under attack, and so the bishop moves into a defensive position, holding on to the pawn for now. Rook to a3, activating the rook. And now there's a number of there's a certain amount of maneuvering in this next section. I'm going to go through the next few moves kind of quickly. As first of all, Maria is not interested in trading off any more pieces. She's going to keep this complement of pieces. She's got a rook, a bishop, and a knight, and just try and see if she can create some problems around the white king. And white's problem is how to make the best use of the pair of rooks and the bishop. And as you see, this bishop is just hemmed in by its own pawn here. But there's a lot of maneuvering because there's no immediate attack that can break through. So there's some feinting with the rooks. The rooks move back and forth here, giving some checks and then backing away, attacking the bishop. Bishop drops back. The knight gets up to a good square, so that's a bit of progress. The king comes to attack it, and now the pawn comes forward to defend the knight. So that check that chased the king back was a little bit of progress for black. But, the chess engine is giving all of this as about even. So b5. This is another interesting moment, and it shows the weakness in white's camp. So let's put that move on again. b5 was played, and you might think, why can't white just take that pawn? This pawn, which could have been taken so many times earlier in the game, cannot be taken now. If you want another tactical quiz, you can take a minute and see if you can figure out why it's not safe to take that pawn. Okay, I'm giving the answer away. After rook takes pawn, which was not played, of course, simply rook to a2, and this threatens checkmate. Rook to there, rook to f2 is checkmate. The king has no squares. That's controlled by the pawn. That square is controlled by the bishop. The rook will be controlling these squares, and the knight and the bishop both support rook f2. So there's no way to stop this except by giving up material with bishop to e2. The line would continue, bishop e2, and knight to h2 check. chasing the king away from defense of the bishop. Notice that the dark squared bishop is controlling all these dark squares. The king can't move anywhere that defends that bishop. So king here, rook takes check, defending the knight. King goes to h1, and black is just up a piece and continuing. Well, it's 2 pieces for a rook, but black has by far the better game at this point. So in this position, Maria can just move that pawn forward, and white can't even take it. So that starts to reveal the problems in the position. Okay, rook d to d2 was played, doubling up on the d file, and now maybe threatening to take the pawn. But, well, rook a3 check, rook to b3 blocking, and now b4 defending the rook. And so this pawn has made its way 2 steps forward, 2 steps closer to scoring a touchdown. Still not a winning advantage necessarily for black, but black's advantage has been slowly increasing over the past few moves. b4, the king goes to e2. Hard to find a real active plan for white. Maybe the king wants to get over here in front of the pawns. In fact, ideally, white would like to rearrange her pieces so that the rook drops back and the bishop comes to b3. If you could arrange that, it'd be pretty good. A bishop on b3 would protect this e-pawn, which is one of the key pieces in white's defense. I mean, it's a pain because it blocks the bishop, but on the other hand, it restrains black's pawns, and so it's an important pawn to hold on to. So that would be a good position that white might strive for, but it seems to be really difficult, if not impossible, to achieve that, just because of the activity of black's pieces poking into white's camp here and restricting all the squares the pieces can go to. Okay, knight to e3 was played. The knight gets into a more active role. And right here, white finally gives up and plays rook takes a3. Now, I tried some experiments on this point, just trying to arrange that position that I talked about, where the rook drops back and then bishop comes forward. So the first problem is that there's a threat of knight to c4. So this rook just can't go to the second rank. It could try dropping all the way back to the first rank, but then knight c4 anyway. This rook is under attack. And then where can it go? Rook to this square is answered by rook a2 check. So you don't really want to give up the second rank. You start to run into problems once again. The king will get chased back to e1. So where else can this go? Actually, rook to b3 is recommended here, just trying to force an exchange. But that gives up this exchange, and this leaves black in good shape. So what else could be tried here besides rook to b1 if we back up? Possibly rook here, just getting out of the way. The idea is just to get the rook out of the way so you can play bishop to c3. Once again, knight c4. This is a better try, actually, but knight c4 still makes things a bit awkward. It's hitting this rook. So rook takes a3, we're trying to avoid that. That's what's played in the game. Rook to c2 maybe, hitting the knight. But then the pawn can actually be pushed on to... oh no, not that pawn. This pawn goes to b5, defending the knight. And now once again, rook takes a3 is the best move here, but still trying to avoid that. Maybe this rook can now drop down to c1, and the bishop can get over to the c3 square like we want to. But now once again, black has rook a2 check, and this control of the second rank is too dangerous. So there just doesn't seem to be any way to get there. That was just an illustration to explain why the move that was played was rook takes a3. And that's actually the best move according to the chess engine. And but it's an unfortunate move to have to play, because this pawn, which started out on b6 as a weak doubled pawn, is now part of a pawn duo here, a pair of protected pass pawns, which are very dangerous. So finally the bishop gets to b3 and can blockade these pawns. So now we are in a situation where the bishops are of opposite color, so it may be difficult, and white can try and set up a blockade here. So now the pawn comes forward to b5. King to f3 is played. hoping maybe to dissolve some pawns over on this side, and basically playing for a draw, because in the long run these pawns are going to be very dangerous. So knight to g4, repositioning the knight, and rook to e2, going after this the weak pawn in in White's camp, in Black's camp. But that pawn is defended by the bishop. Anyway, the knight goes to f6, hitting the d pawn here. Bishop to a2 is played. So this bishop is staying on this diagonal. It's going to blockade these pawns. The pawn comes forward to b4. And now rook to e1. So White is just kind of waiting at this point and seeing if Black can make a breakthrough of any kind. So just trying to hold the line. So there's some more maneuvering. Let's go forward a few moves. Bishop to d6, rook e3, just kind of moving the pieces around. Rook e6, king h7, rook e3, the king moves. So just some more maneuvering until this point here. Move 58, the move g5 is played, trying for a breakthrough. And now kind of the last mistake in the game. The white player here could still hold on with the move king to d4 and just try and hold this position with the king on d4. That's a good square for the king, and the bishop can't immediately chase the king away, although that can be arranged. I mean, king d4 is a bit dangerous because after the knight goes here, the bishop can come here with check, and a skewer would pick up the rook, so you have to be careful. But anyway, that's the way to hold things for the moment. Also, rook e1, I guess, is a playable move. But what Antoinetta played here was pawn takes, and now this is a losing position. The king comes forward to attack these pawns, and these two pawn weaknesses are just too much for White to defend, in addition to trying to hold back these pawns over on the queen side. So king to d4 now is played, and king takes g5. So it's just a trade so far, but it's also left behind this weak pawn on g3. So the bishop stays on this diagonal, and now Maria starts maneuvering her knight over, and you'll see the point of this in a few moves. The knight goes to this key square h5, hitting the pawn on g3, and there's just no way to defend it. It's on the wrong color, so it can't be defended by the bishop. Only the rook can defend it, and the king and the bishop are occupied over here on the queen side, holding back these pawns. So this is an example of the principle of two weaknesses in the endgame. If your opponent in the endgame has two weaknesses, you can shift your attention from one to the other and usually create a victory by breaking through on one side or the other. And so the two weaknesses in this case, one of them is this pawn on g3, and the other weakness is not a pawn over here, but it's just the fact that these pieces are tied up on the queen side, preventing the two pawns from queening. So that's the two weaknesses in this case. So the pawn on g3 falls, and Black or White, Antoinetta, in sort of a desperate maneuver, tries to take up this bishop and gobble up these pawns, but this just doesn't work. Let's see, is there any other move that could be tried? King b3 is the chess engine suggestion, but well, this is losing too. f4 can be played, and this pawn is just going to march through, and it will cost at least a piece. White is going to have to give up a piece to stop that pawn, and the bishop is holding on to these pawns. So it's understandable that in this position, rook takes d6 was played. At least Antoinetta can pick up a few pawns. After pawn takes rook, then king takes b4. But now f4 is played anyway, and Antoinetta resigned. So the problem is this one lone bishop can't stop both pawns, and this pawn is coming through. So let's see. For example, if king takes, then the pawn goes forward. The bishop could come to this square to try and hold on to the pawn, but now f2, and now the king comes over to try and hold on to things. King to f4, king comes over, king to e3, and White's starting to run out of moves. Where can the king go? It can go up or down. Maybe it doesn't matter a whole lot. Say king to c2, and now knight to e2, blocking the view of the bishop of the queening square, and that pawn is just going to queen. So there's just no way to stop that from happening. And the pawn on, so in this position, after f4 was played, white resigned. This pawn can be given up at this point because this pawn on the f-file can't be stopped. So that's how that game ended, and Maria Muzychuk went on to defeat Antoaneta Stefanova and proceed into the round 4. So to give a wrap-up of the tournament so far, there are now 8 players left, and Humpy Canero, the top women player in the tournament and the reigning world champion, has had a great run so far in this tournament. She's had 6 straight wins, so she's through to round 4. And her opponent in round 4 is going to be Maria Muzychuk, the winner of this round. 2 other players, Natalia Poganina, who we looked at last round. We looked at her game last round. She's going to face Zui Zhao from China. On the third board, we're going to have Pia Kramling of Sweden facing Anna Muzychuk from the Ukraine, Maria's sister. So both sisters are still in the tournament. And on board 4, we have Mary Arabidze from Georgia facing Dronavali Harika from India. So interesting lineup for round 4. Stay tuned for that coverage, and I will see you then. Bye.